it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today I think I have a fun one for you today, and that is going to be chatting through the basic books that I personally love. Before we go into the books themselves, I do just feel like I want to clarify that these are all books I've given 4 or 5 stars, stories that I personally have really enjoyed, but also just have to acknowledge that either not everyone loves them and some of them are notoriously divided in terms of enjoyment versus not, but most of them definitely rely on some very common tropes that you see prevalent through a lot of different contemporary or fantasy or romance stories. But for me personally, I feel like they're all very successful in terms of writing them, and therefore they're all really entertaining and a lot of fun. That being said, I definitely can acknowledge and understand why some people would view them as basic, but personally to me, I think they're great and would really recommend. Without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the book. Starting with the author, I would say very much kind of inspired this whole thing, and that is Sarah J Maas. Sarah J Maas, I would say, is a pretty notorious author. I think you either love her or you hate her. All of the criticisms she receives are entirely valid. I completely acknowledge that as an author, her tropes can be a little problematic, a little focused on the alpha. Her cast of characters can be a little vanilla, and generally speaking, her plot lines can be a little recycled. On the other side of that though, there is not a Sarah J Maas book I have picked up and not read in like 3 days. For me personally, her writing and her ability to write captivating romantic subplots that just completely grip me just makes her an author that I just personally really enjoy reading her books, but also completely acknowledge that she's not for everyone, and also can 100% agree that her romance can kind of veer to the ridiculous. Some of the word choice is very interesting. But to cycle through 3 of the series, I have all 3 series that she has put out. I have read every book she's released, and I've always found them to be really engaging and interesting. The first one is Throne of Glass. Next is A Court of Thorns and Roses. Last is Crescent City, of course, all by Sarah J Maas. I would say all of these books have fantastical elements, and there's definitely a fantasy primary plot, but I would say her strength and the reason why I personally love these books are definitely the romance subplots. And in some of these series, I would say it's not even a subplot, it is main plot. I say all these books eventually, if not start, definitely in the new adult category. They are very romance and steamy centric, and again, that's kind of where I was referencing some of the specific word choice. That being said, I do feel like she's able to craft yearning and just a really fast-paced story. Some of her books are incredibly long, but I always fly through them. They're cheesy, they're absurd, but for me personally, I have always enjoyed her books and I will continue to read them. Especially with Crescent City, I do feel like with this, her fantasy subplots have gotten much better, and I do feel like her fantasy worlds are kind of expanding and not so much of a sort of like basic sort of way where it's kind of just a vehicle for the romance. This has some really imaginative and interesting urban fantasy ideas, which I'm excited to see expanded within the next books of the series. That being said, I feel like Sarah J Maas is kind of the crown of this video in that I do really love her books and I will continue to read them, but completely understand they are not for everyone. The next author I will also put on this list is Cassandra Clare. I have been reading Cassandra Clare books since I was in middle school, and I honestly felt like there was a point that I would grow out of her novels, and there almost was. I feel like if I went back and read the original City of Bones series and also the 3 that came after that, I probably wouldn't really be so interested in her novels anymore, as those tropes are I'm kind of beyond. That being said, her recent trilogies have captivated me just as much as when I read City of Bones for the first time. Again, while I do feel like there's a fantasy plot that she definitely fleshes out in a really interesting way, Shadowhunters fighting demons, all of those things, and it's set in different time periods depending on what series you're reading. My favorite element to all of her books, and will always be my favorite element to all of her books, is the romance and the complicated yearning. I feel like with every series she thinks of a new and more complicated way to keep 2 characters apart that only want to be together, and you read all the books just like waiting for it to happen. She's excellent in creating anticipation, but I can also acknowledge that this is sort of a formula, and for some people it would probably be a little repetitive, but for me this formula works every time, 10 out of 10, you know what I mean? And I would just say, like, I've been really impressed with her recent trilogies, and I would also say, while continuing to up the ante from a romance perspective, I do feel like she's really elevated her plots as well, really ensuring that they're both modern and interesting and fresh. I haven't written so many books in this Shadowhunter world. There was definitely an opportunity to kind of overwrite this sort of series, but to me, I really feel like she's expanded it in a really thoughtful and compelling way. But yeah, I love Cassandra Clare. I will be a stan for as long as I can. As long as she keeps writing really entertaining books, I will be reading them. Next, we have a book to fave, and that is Cruel Prince by Holly Black. Another fantasy novel with a heavy romance subplot. I feel like there's a trend you should be sensing here, is that obviously I'm a huge fantasy reader and I love deep, intense, political-based fantasy, but I also love a fantasy that's a little fluffy, really just there for the background noise, where we really just have a central romance of two people who hate each other but ultimately fall in love in some sort of capacity at play, and I feel like The Cruel Prince does that, but ups the ante even more, and that this is also a fae-centered fantasy story. In terms of buzzwords, fae court politics, where glamour and beauty and everything sort of disguised under this sort of smoke and mirrors, but everything is disgusting and dark underneath, is something I always love to read. I love fae-centered YA fantasy romance especially. I just always think it's really entertaining and fun and ridiculous, and I feel like the Cruel Prince series by Holly Black is one of the best examples of this. And while ultimately I did find the third book to be a little underwhelming as a conclusion, I felt like this series was a perfectly built angsty YA romance fae story with some fantasy politics interplaying in there as well. The two characters that are centered here, Carden and Jude, will just grip you from page one. This is a story where we follow our main character Jude, who is living in this fae world as a half human, half fae. Because of this, she is confronted consistently with treachery. People play with her like she's a mouse almost, her and her sister. And this first one, she's offered an opportunity to kind of gain some power for herself, politically speaking. Throughout this series, you see her come to odds with the person she hates the most, which is Carden, and also fight some romantic feelings they both have for each other. It's dark and dramatic, but there's also some familial conflict as well between her and her sister and just her father. It is really angsty. It has lots of different emotions at play. I wish the political world was fleshed out a bit more, but I'll be honest, I did not really continue reading this book because of the political world. I read it because of Jude and Carden, and it was a great time the whole time. Next, I have Bringing Down the Duke, and I would say from my experience, I would just kind of include Regency romance within this. I love Regency romance. This is a genre that I really started reading for the first time this year, and one that I fell head over heels in love with. It's absolutely escapism literature for me. It is just so much fun. I would read all these books within a 24-hour period. It was just something that really engaged me and put a smile on my face. That being said, I can also acknowledge that for at least the Regency romance novels I have read, which I can only really speak to, there is definitely a setup that is sort of followed through in most of the books. Like, certain tropes are honestly present in every book I have ever read, and the setup and like the structure of the story in a similar fashion as well. You kind of go in expecting a certain type of ride, and I don't mind that. It's what I'm looking for. I also think I love Regency romance as much as I do because it is almost as much of a fantasy as Game of Thrones. I mean, in itself, the amount of brooding, hot single dukes that are available throughout these books is so historically inaccurate, or I can basically say that really there's nothing historically accurate going on in any type of Regency romance. It's really this sort of soft Regency setting, the manners, the dresses, the gasps, the balls. It just makes it for a really good time. Bringing Down the Duke is one of my favorite examples of Regency romance. This is a story that is just, I don't know, it swept me away with page one. I thought it was such a grand old time, and honestly the first Regency romance I actually picked up and kind of started my whole like read 8 books within this genre within a 6-week period. But this is a story we follow our main character Annabelle, who really just wants to study at a university. Obviously during the time period this is really not accepted or allowed. She's actually in the recipient of getting a scholarship to Oxford from the Women's Suffrage Society. However, her cousin kind of takes over her estate after her father passes away, and is really controlling and only lets her go as long as she promises to not bring any shame to the family name, which would obviously include not, involving herself in the suffrage society, but she has to do it to ensure that she can maintain her enrollment. Part of her responsibility is to go up to different dukes and lords to essentially rally them to their cause. She does this, she meets a duke named Montgomery who is handsome, cold, and aloof, and naturally they fall in love. There's manor houses, there's snowstorms, there's angst, it's all there. It was a grand old ride, and honestly, I just love this formula, and I will keep reading it. But I really want to articulate, Regency romance is essentially fantasy. So if you love fantasy, check this out. Next, I'm going to be chatting about a general genre that also is just one that I think is a lot of fun. And both these books within this genre are by Jennifer L. Armentrout that I'm going to chat about because I think they're great examples of this. It is essentially a paranormal romance with an urban fantasy setting. So like there's fantasy and there's action and there's combat, but really again, romance is the primary element within this book, often utilizing some common tropes of a brooding, secretive, attractive man and a woman who is like trying to go against the grain, become strong for some sort of reason to like claim back her family or her identity. They fight and spar a lot and then probably kiss while doing it. It's dramatic, but a lot of fun. And this particular series I think is a great example of it. These are both like spin-off series. The first one is White Hot Kiss by Jennifer L. Armentrout, and if you can't get kind of what's going on based on the title, I'll give you a bit more information. This is a world where gargoyles exist, which basically kill demons and protect humans from demons running amok. Our main character has grown up in a gargoyle-like compound and household, but she is actually herself half demon. She's always been in love with a boy who's kind of always lived on the compound, but then one day she meets a full demon and begins to realize there's more about her background and her past than she realized, and maybe she should like begin to harness parts of herself she's been repressing, growing up in a gargoyle household. So yeah, demon hunters, gargoyles, two groups of people just completely at odds with each other. Dramatic, amazing. The spin-off series follows more people kind of involved in this world, also gargoyles, but our other main character, Trinity, has a select and interesting set of powers that makes her unique and also one that needs to be protected. Similar setup here, two people that should not like each other begin to like each other. Lots of angst, lots of drama, lots of action, lots of training scenes. It's great. These tropes get me every time, especially when they're well written. I think that's kind of like an important thing to say here. Like all these books, in my opinion, and why I like them is that I feel like they write these tropes that are common really well. And because of that, you get really entertaining and fun stories. There's a reason why these tropes are something a lot of people write about, because they work. When you do it right, like this series, it can be a lot of fun. I definitely love the White Hot Kiss and the Harbinger series. These are both set in the same world, following similar characters, and they are a grand time. Last book I'm gonna chat about is Anna K by Jenny Lee. This contains tropes that I feel like I also just love so much, like Gossip Girl, Vampire Diaries. Essentially, like, this is a CW show following high schoolers basically acting like late 20-year-olds with a bunch of money. But the reason why Anna K works so well is that it is actually an Anna Karenina retelling. So the fact that all of these teenagers are acting in such an absurd fashion, spending all this money, doing all these glamorous parties, and having these intense relationships really fits with the retelling element of this, which is why I really enjoyed this. And I know this is gonna be adapted into a television show and it's gonna work so, so well. That being said, I do feel like you have to go into this book understanding that these characters don't feel like real teenagers. They feel like a modern interpretation of rich aristocratic children, basically without rules or expectations, doing anything they want, and that is definitely at play within this novel. But this is as I said, an Anna Karenina retelling following a variety and a huge cast of characters. One of the most dramatic contemporary books I have ever read, but primarily we follow Anna K, and she's kind of this really beautiful, enigmatic, and generally beloved girl across all social groups. She has a boyfriend who goes to Harvard, and he is like on the fast track into politics. She kind of has her whole life figured out, but then she meets and falls in love with the wrong boy, and this kind of turns the whole story upside down. Everyone is kind of pulled into different camps. Dramatic things happen left and right. I'm talking like $100,000 parties thrown so this boy can meet up with Anna K in secret. It's like ridiculous, but it's also so much fun. There's glitz, there's glamour, and I think it was done in such a successful fashion. And again, I feel like you just kind of have to suspend your disbelief that these are not true high schoolers, but I do feel like it's a pretty faithful nod to the Anna Karenina story, and I thought this was amazing. I read it in 24 hours. It was super fast paced, and I thought the tropes in this, sort of this dramatic high school setting, was done with such success. So this is a book I loved as well. Guys, those are some basic books that I love. I personally don't think any of these books are actually basic, but anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you soon with another one soon. Goodbye.